Security, get that trash out of my sight. Now. The command was not spoken. It was spat. A shard of venom that sliced through the symphony of champagne flutes and polite laughter, shattering the fragile elegance of the evening. Conversations evaporated mid-syllable. A young waiter, balancing a silver tray of crystalline glasses, froze in place, his posture a sculpture of pure panic. Above, the grand nebula chandeliers of the Apex Tower's inaugural gala pulsed with a soft, golden light. But in the sudden, suffocating silence, they felt less like stars and more like interrogations lamps, exposing every raw nerve in the room. The voice belonged to Isabella Thorne, a woman poured into a dress the color of fresh blood. The crimson silk was an act of aggression, short, sharp, and engineered to command the eye. It clung to her frame like a second, more honest skin, radiating a brutal confidence born not from achievement, but from a lifetime of being watched, of being adorned, of being envied. She was the wife of Julian Thorne, the real estate titan, and tonight she was the queen of this glass and steel kingdom. Every soul in this hall knew her, feared her, or wanted to be her. Her gaze, however, was a laser beam fixed on a figure the room had collectively ignored until this very moment. A woman in cobalt blue. The blue wasn't loud. It wasn't the electric blue of a nightclub or the royal blue of a coronation. It was the deep, abyssal blue of the midnight ocean. A color that held its own light, absorbing the room's golden glare and glowing with a quiet, defiant energy. Her dress was a masterpiece of understatement, tailored with architectural precision to move without a whisper. Its power was in its form, its simplicity. No diamond necklace screamed for attention at her throat. No glitter or sequins betrayed her purpose. In a room where everyone was shouting their worth, her presence alone was the statement, as steady and self-contained as a lone flame that refuses to flicker in a storm. She moved with a measured, unhurried pace, her posture a study in unbroken lines, as if the polished marble floor itself recalibrated its level to accommodate her steps. Her hair was swept back in a severe, elegant chignon that left her face completely open, a testament to a woman with nothing to hide and absolutely nothing to prove. In this churning sea of performative noise, she was a column of composed silence, and that, it seemed, was the greatest provocation of all to the woman in red. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Isabella Thorne scoffed, her voice now a theatrical drawl, amplified by the hall's acoustics, designed for a woman who never had to ask for the room's attention. "We are inaugurating a monument to human ambition, a skyscraper that cost more than the GDP of a small nation, and someone dressed like a goddamn blueberry dares to just walk in?" A nervous ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. A few sycophants chuckled, a desperate, pathetic sound from men and women unwilling to be excluded from Isabella's orbit of power. Phones, thin as wafers and glowing with futuristic light, rose from behind champagne glasses, their lenses discreetly capturing the unfolding drama. Near the bar, a young journalist, Kalen Vance, whispered into his comlink, his live feed already streaming to 1,000 followers. "She doesn't look out of place," he muttered, his voice a mix of confusion and awe. "She looks like she owns the place." But Isabella wasn't finished. She was an artist, and public humiliation was her medium. She tilted her champagne flute, the bubbles catching the light, savoring the exquisite cruelty in her tone. "Cobalt blue," she mused, circling the woman like a shark. "How bold. How fitting, I suppose, if you were a porta-potty at a construction site." A small, tight circle of guests near her finally broke, stifling their laughter behind manicured hands. Their smiles were sharpened by a collective, delicious embarrassment. The insult, now free, echoed off the marble and glass, a ricocheting bullet of contempt. The woman in blue did not react. Not a blink, not a twitch of a muscle, not a single breath wasted on a response. Her stillness wasn't the passivity of submission. It was the stillness of immense weight. It was the kind of gravity that pulled the very air in the room tighter, that forced people to lean in and pay attention without understanding why. She had heard words like these before. They were the same words, just dressed in different clothes. She'd heard them in dusty classrooms in her youth, whispered by girls whose futures were already written for them. She'd heard them in sterile, male-dominated boardrooms, spoken by men who saw her ambition as a defect. She'd heard them at charity dinners just like this one, in the dismissive glances and the introductions that skipped right over her name. Tonight, the same old poison was simply served in a designer silk dress with a champagne chaser. But she remained rooted, a silent monolith against the storm. The silence stretching out from her became a physical presence, a pressure that was rapidly becoming unbearable for everyone else. Before we continue, before this powder keg explodes, I have to ask, where are you joining us from tonight? Drop your city, your country, your corner of the world in the comments below. And if you believe that dignity is the only armor that truly matters, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. These stories are a reminder that the world can be changed, and we're damn glad you're here to witness it. Now, back to her, back to the woman in cobalt blue. She didn't need to strike back with words. Her composure was the strike. Her restraint was the gathering storm. And though no one in this room of titans and heirs knew her name yet, every single one of them could feel it in their bones. This was not the simple, fleeting humiliation of a stranger. This was the prelude to a reckoning. The ghost of the crowd's laughter still lingered in the air, but the woman in blue did not break her stride. Her heels, elegant but practical, met the marble with a quiet, rhythmic cadence that was neither hurried nor hesitant. She moved as if she had walked through 1,000 rooms exactly like this one, yet she carried the unmistakable air of someone who had zero interest in being noticed by any of them. She had arrived without the usual fanfare, without a frantic assistant trailing in her wake, without a stylist fussing over the drape of her dress, without the orbiting sycophants that were the telltale sign of new money. No screaming designer logos announced her financial worth. No blinding jewelry flashed like a billboard of her husband's wealth. In a crowd where every single guest was desperately competing to shimmer and shine, she had chosen to stand like a mountain stone, unpolished, unadorned, and absolutely undeniable. Her invitation, a thick card of pressed fiber embossed with the golden seal of the Apex Tower Development Group, was still folded neatly in her hand. By all rights, that seal was a key capable of opening any door in the city of Neo-Viridia. But when Isabella Thorne, the Mogul's wife, sneered from her self-appointed throne, even that golden seal seemed to vanish into thin air, invisible to the ravenous eyes of the elite. The crowd itself was a living gallery of calculated excess, tuxedos woven in the last remaining ateliers of Milan, gowns custom-dyed to match the effervescence of vintage champagne, shoes that cost more than a year's rent in the sprawling urban sectors below the floating penthouses. The conversations were a rehearsed ballet of numbers, profits, acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, interstellar mineral rights, inheritances. Every gesture was a performance, every smile a negotiation. And then there was her. The cobalt blue dress did not compete with their brilliance. It simply claimed its own space. She had chosen the color with meticulous care. Not black, which would have allowed her to blend into the shadows. Not gold, which would have been a desperate plea for their approval. Cobalt blue, the color of the deep sea, of twilight, of fire burning at its absolute hottest. A color that dared to say, I am not here to fade into your perfectly curated background. But to Isabella Thorne, that silent declaration was a personal insult, an intolerable act of defiance. From her vantage point at the magnetic center of the hall, she looked down on the woman in blue as if she were a glitch in the flawless photograph of her family's legacy. To her, the Apex Tower's opening ceremony was not a party. It was the coronation of the Thorne Empire, and no empire, however new, tolerates an intruder in the throne room. She gestured again to the two security guards, her voice louder now, laced with irritation. "Check her credentials. Do it quickly." The guards, both ex-military men with physiques like reinforced concrete, hesitated. It wasn't because they doubted Isabella's authority. It was because of the unnerving calm in the woman's eyes. She didn't fidget. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't look afraid. She simply extended the sealed envelope forward, her hand as steady as a surgeon's, with an air that said, "Everything you need to know is right here, and still, you will choose to question me." The silence in the room pressed tighter, becoming a physical weight on everyone's shoulders. Guests craned their necks, their curiosity now fully aroused. Phones captured the frozen tableau, the crimson dress versus the cobalt blue, raw accusation versus unshakable composure. The woman in blue allowed herself one slow, deliberate breath. She had walked into hundreds, if not thousands, of rooms just like this one. Rooms where her very presence was measured against the color of her skin before her words could ever be heard. Rooms where she had to prove, again and again and again, that her place at the table was not borrowed, not stolen, and certainly not begged for. And tonight, she decided, she would let them believe whatever they wished. Because she knew a secret so profound and so powerful that it made this entire glittering spectacle feel like a child's play. This hall, this tower, this entire billion-dollar empire, none of it, not a single rivet or pane of glass, could exist without her. But for now, she remained silent, letting the weight of their collective prejudice build higher and higher, brick upon ignorant brick, a skyscraper of sheer arrogance just waiting for the perfect moment to come crashing down. The embossed envelope was still held in her outstretched hand, thick, undeniable, a physical manifestation of her right to be there. It should have been enough to quell the whispers, to silence the doubt. But Isabella Thorne wasn't interested in proof. She was interested in performance. She craved a spectacle, and she had just found her leading lady. She began to circle the woman in blue, a predator sizing up her prey. Her crimson dress flashed and swirled under the chandeliers like a living flame. With every deliberate step, she raised her voice just enough for the nearest concentric circle of guests to catch her words. And once those words were heard, they spread through the crowd like a toxic perfume, sweet and intoxicating for some, suffocating and poisonous for others. "Tell me," she purred, gesturing theatrically with her champagne flute, "who let her in?" A few nervous chuckles bubbled up from the crowd, desperate to please. A man in a velvet jacket, whose family had been losing money for 3 generations, leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Probably some social climber with a borrowed pass. Got lucky." His date, wearing a dress that cost more than his car, laughed too loudly, eager to align herself with the power, with the cruelty, with Isabella. Isabella's smirk widened. She was feeding on their complicity. "I mean, really," she continued, her tone rising as if she were now addressing the entire hall from a stage. "A skyscraper of this scale, of this grandeur, this future-defining symbol of our great city, and someone dressed like that believes she belongs here?" The laughter sharpened this time, no longer muffled by politeness. Guests turned openly, their faces a mixture of emotions, some nakedly cruel, some morbidly curious, all of them caught in the powerful gravity of a public humiliation. A server, passing by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, slowed his pace, his eyes wide, unsure whether he should keep walking into the line of fire or simply vanish behind the heavy velvet curtains. The woman in cobalt blue remained utterly still, her breath calm, her gaze unwavering. But Isabella wasn't finished. She was building to a crescendo. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, her words slicing through the air like blades disguised as silk. "Do you even know where you are, sweetheart? This isn't a charity banquet for the underprivileged. This isn't a suburban mall opening. This is history being written. And you? You're just a distraction, a smudge, an unfortunate splash of blue fabric." A collective ripple of gasps mixed with the fresh wave of laughter. This was more direct, more personal, more brutal than before. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. A few even shifted their weight, a subtle physical manifestation of the question forming in their minds. Should they stand with the predator or the prey? Isabella, however, sensed no danger. She was drunk on her own power, mistaking the crowd's captivated silence for unwavering support. She raised her glass high, her grin wide and triumphant, and declared, her voice ringing with finality, "Security! I said remove her!" The two guards moved, their steps still uncertain, still hesitant. Something about the woman in blue unsettled them to their core. Her profound stillness wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. It was weight. It was authority. It was like standing too close to a statue carved from ancient, unyielding stone. You hesitate before laying a hand on it, fearing it might be you who shatters, not the stone. The crowd buzzed, their voices layering into a chaotic chorus of mockery and speculation. "Check her papers. Probably just a simple mistake. She's brave, I'll give her that. No, she's foolish." Phones kept rolling, their tiny red lights like a constellation of malevolent stars. A live stream chat projected onto the augmented reality lenses of 1,000 viewers across the city, filled with a torrent of comments. Who is she? Why are they doing this to her? She doesn't look lost or scared at all. And yet, in the very eye of this hurricane of scorn, the woman in cobalt blue neither defended herself nor offered a single word of explanation. Her silence pressed harder against the room than Isabella's insults, like gravity-bending light, bending the very shape of the hall. For a moment, it seemed as though the towering glass walls themselves were leaning inward, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable breaking point. The guards hesitated at the edge of the marble floor, their orders clear, but their instincts screaming caution. The woman in blue didn't plead, didn't flinch, didn't move back an inch. She simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the embossed envelope, the other at her side, her posture so perfectly rooted it was as if the ground itself had chosen her side in this conflict. Isabella's chin tilted higher, a vein of pure irritation beginning to throb in her temple. "What are you waiting for?" Her words cracked like a whip, but this time the impact fell dull, absorbed by the woman's profound silence. The crowd, the entire glittering assembly of Neo-Viridia's elite, waited for the woman in blue to falter, to protest, to explain herself, to do something. But she offered them nothing. Her silence was a calculated void. It stretched through the room like a slow, inexorable tide, washing over the polished marble, seeping into the gilded corners, drowning out the nervous chatter. Even the cruel laughter stumbled, unsure of its own echo. A few guests lowered their phones, a sudden, unfamiliar sense of discomfort washing over them. This no longer felt like a joke. It felt like witnessing something sacred being violated. The string quartet, still poised in a state of suspended animation, let their bows hover over their instruments. The air was taut, stretched to its limit, and in that suffocating silence, her presence grew, expanding to fill every inch of the room. Her eyes were steady, unflinching. They did not rise in defiance nor drop in submission. They simply existed, calm as ancient stone, unyielding as forged steel. They belonged to a woman who had been tested in fires far hotter than this one, too many times to react to yet another trial by ignorance. She remembered boardrooms where men twice her age, with half her intellect, had told her she was too ambitious, too aggressive. She remembered negotiations where powerful partners had assumed she was the assistant, there to take notes, not the one with the authority to sign the contracts. She remembered dinners where introductions skipped right over her name, as if she were a piece of the furniture. The tone never changed, only the setting. Tonight, it came wrapped in crimson silk, dripping from the lips of a Mogul's wife, and still, she gave it nothing. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their own reflections suddenly visible in the polished floor. The silence pressed on them now, heavier with every passing second. The smug, self-satisfied curve of Isabella's smile began to twitch at the corner, unsettled by the refusal of her target to play the role assigned to her. Humiliation required a reaction. It needed a victim. Without one, the scene was incomplete, the power dynamic broken. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether to physically act without a clearer justification. One muttered under his breath, "She doesn't look like a threat." The other, his jaw clenched, kept his eyes fixed on the envelope she held. Still, she did not move. Her breath was even, her stance was unshaken, her silence was not an absence of sound, it was pressure, invisible yet undeniable. Isabella, desperate to fill the void she had created, laughed again, louder this time. "Well, cat got your tongue?" Her voice rang out, but it sounded thinner now, brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. The woman in cobalt blue blinked. Once. Slowly. It was a blink that said more than any retort ever could. It was a blink that carried years of practice, of absorbing insults, of holding ground, of letting others expose their own ugliness with their own venom. And the crowd felt it. They felt the power in that stillness, the immense strength in that restraint. The humiliation had reversed its course. It was no longer hers to bear. The silence should have been the end of the scene. In most rooms, in most scenarios, it would have been. An insult is delivered, a smirk is offered, and the target is forced to walk away in shame. But here, under the celestial glow of the nebula chandeliers and the watchful, omniscient spire of the apex tower itself, silence only magnified the moment. And the cameras, everywhere, caught it all. At the edge of the hall, Kalen Vance, the young reporter, clutched his phone tighter, his live stream already going viral. He hadn't intended to film this. He had come to capture wide shots of champagne glasses, to get sound bites for his nightly segment, to conduct polite, pre-approved interviews with donors. Instead, his lens was now locked on the elemental clash between the red dress and the blue dress, and the silent, violent storm raging between them. His audience grew by the second, then by the thousands. "Who is she?" flashed across the chat in a dozen languages. "Why are they laughing at her? This is disgusting." "That woman in blue, she doesn't look scared. She looks powerful." Dozens of emojis flooded the screen. Angry faces, flames, raised fists of solidarity. Another guest, a wealthy shipping magnate completely unaware of the live stream, whispered too close to Kalen's microphone. "I have a feeling she's important." You don't just treat someone with that kind of poise like that. The comment exploded online. See? Even the people there know something is wrong. Isabella, of course, saw none of it. In her world, the room belonged to her. She believed humiliation was a private theater, a performance for her and her chosen audience. But humiliation, once recorded, once streamed, is no longer private. It becomes evidence. Click. Another camera flash, this one from a professional. A photographer from a major business magazine, sensing a real story, leaned in, capturing every angle. Not the gowns, not the speeches, but the frozen, electrifying clash. The crimson silk leaning forward in aggression, the cobalt blue dress standing firm in defiance, the two guards trapped in their own frustrated hesitation. By the hors d'oeuvres table, two waiters exchanged a hushed glance. "She hasn't moved an inch," one muttered. The other shook his head slowly. "That's not fear, man. That's something else entirely." Their quiet words, though barely audible, joined the growing hum of the hall, and that hum joined the live stream. And soon, the narrative of the evening began to shift. Irrevocably, Isabella tried to laugh again, to reclaim her stage, but the sound rang hollow, a discordant note in the tense symphony of the room. She raised her voice higher, a desperate attempt to regain control. "This is ridiculous. Do I really have to explain to everyone in this room why she doesn't belong here?" The crowd didn't laugh this time. They hesitated. It was a pause just long enough for the reporters' chat to seize the moment. They're realizing it. Look at the faces in the background. The tide is turning. The woman in cobalt blue remained still, but her silence no longer stood alone. It was echoed now, multiplied, carried on the screens of thousands of strangers across the city, across the world. The power dynamic of a room can shift in a single instant. Sometimes it shifts with a shout, sometimes with applause, and sometimes with the simple, profound decision of one person to remain completely unshaken while the world watches. Isabella Thorne did not yet understand, but everyone else could feel it. Something irreversible had just begun. Isabella Thorne was not accustomed to resistance, and she certainly wasn't accustomed to being ignored. Silence unnerved her. Indifference was a mockery more profound than any spoken retort could ever be. And so she reached for the one tool guaranteed to reclaim the spotlight, the one instrument of absolute control in any room, the microphone on the central podium. She strode to the stage and tapped it once. Thump! The sound was a dull, heavy heartbeat that carried across the marble hall, pulling every eye, every camera towards the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone a weaponized honey, sweet but sharp at the edges. "Before we proceed with tonight's grand celebration, it seems we have a situation." The crowd shifted, a collective rustle of silk and wool. Glasses clinked nervously. Cameras tilted toward her, and then back toward the woman in cobalt blue, who still stood, serene and unmoved, by the center aisle. Isabella gestured with a casual, dismissive flick of her hand. "It appears someone has wandered into our grand opening. An unfortunate mix-up, I am sure. Security is handling it." A wave of polite, strained laughter ran through the hall, but it was thinner this time, laced with uncertainty. Some guests smiled only because they thought they were supposed to. Isabella leaned into the microphone, her smile widening into a predatory grin. "You know, I almost admire the courage it must take. To walk into a billion-dollar tower dressed as though you were headed to, what shall we say, a neighborhood brunch?" Her voice rang out, magnified, inescapable. The insult echoed against the vast glass walls, bounced from marble to marble, and landed squarely on the woman in blue. The crowd stirred. Some gasped, some smirked, Some whispered furiously. Kalen Vance's livestream chat exploded. "She said that into the mic! This is public humiliation on a whole other level. Blue Lady isn't even flinching." But Isabella, high on the spectacle, pressed harder. She had her stage, and she would not relinquish it. "I mean, look at her," she said, raising her glass high for emphasis, a queen addressing her court. "Cobalt blue, bold, yes, but perhaps more suited for safety vests or traffic cones. Wouldn't you all agree?" This time the laughter wasn't nervous. It was sharp. It cut. A ripple of cruel chuckles spread across the hall like a toxic wave, fed by those too afraid to stand apart, too weak to defy the queen. The woman in blue remained motionless. Her stillness was no longer just silence. It was defiance carved in stone. She met no one's gaze, yet she seemed to see everything. The smirks, the pity, the simmering unease. The guards, seeing her now publicly condemned, froze mid-step, unwilling to touch her without more direct physical orders. The weight of the moment pressed down on their shoulders. Isabella, sensing their hesitation and enraged by it, sneered into the microphone. "What are you waiting for? Escort her out, quickly, before she embarrasses herself any further." But the embarrassment did not belong to the woman in cobalt blue. Not anymore. It clung instead to Isabella's laughter, which was now forced and brittle. It clung to the guests whose smiles trembled at the edges. It clung to the cameras that caught every flicker of cruelty and streamed it far beyond these marble walls. The hall, once a theater of celebration, had become a courtroom. And though Isabella stood with the microphone, with the presumed power, the real authority in the room was shifting, silently, invisibly, toward the figure in blue, who had not yet spoken a single word. The laughter hadn't fully faded when Isabella descended from the stage, her stiletto heels striking the marble like gunfire. Each step was a declaration of ownership, of territory. The microphone dangled from her hand, a useless prop now, but her voice carried loud enough without it. She closed the distance between herself and the woman in blue, circling her slowly, as though she were inspecting a strange, invasive species that had somehow breached the walls of her kingdom. The crowd leaned in, a captive audience hungry for the final act of this brutal drama. And then her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, found the envelope. That thick card, that embossed golden seal, crisp and official against the woman's palm. Proof of belonging, a key that no insult could erase. Isabella's smile sharpened into a blade. "Ah, so that's your trick," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension as she reached forward with long, manicured fingers. "A borrowed invitation. How quaint." The guards tensed, but did not move. Cameras lifted higher, zooming in. Before anyone could react, before a single voice could object, she snatched the envelope from the woman's hand. A collective gasp ripped across the hall, the sound of 100 people sucking in their breath at once, echoing like broken glass. The woman in blue did not resist. Her hand remained steady at her side, her expression unchanged, as though this violation had been not only anticipated, but factored into a much larger equation. Isabella held the envelope high, displaying it to the crowd like a piece of captured evidence. "You see," she announced, her voice ringing with triumph. "This is what desperation looks like, pretending to belong, waving a piece of paper around as if that makes you someone." And then, with a theatrical, contemptuous flick of her wrist, she ripped it in half. "Rip." The sound was obscene, a violent tearing in the heart of the silent room. Paper shredded between her fingers, the golden seal cleaved in two, the pieces fluttering down to the polished marble floor like dead leaves, like ashes. The crowd gasped again, a second, more shocked wave. Some applauded nervously, unsure if cruelty disguised as confidence was still something to be admired. Others turned away, their faces pale, sensing a fundamental line had just been crossed. Kaylin Vance's livestream chat erupted. She destroyed her invite. That's actually illegal. Blue Lady hasn't even blinked. What is she made of? The woman in blue remained still. Her eyes lowered for a fraction of a second, a brief, dismissive glance at the scraps of paper at her feet, and then lifted again, calm, unbroken. The silence around her thickened, becoming heavier than the insult itself, heavier than the act of destruction. Isabella laughed, a high, brittle sound, basking in her own audacity. "There," she said, tossing the last fragment to the ground with a flourish. Problem solved. Now, security, for the last time. Remove her before she embarrasses us all further. But no one moved. The guards shifted uncomfortably on their feet. Guests fidgeted with their glasses, avoiding each other's eyes. The reporter's camera zoomed in, capturing every fluttering scrap of paper on the immaculate marble floor. The woman in blue stood as though rooted to the very bedrock of the earth, unshaken by the petty violence of paper and pride. Her silence no longer felt like endurance. It felt like judgment. Isabella, still grinning, failed to see what the rest of the room now sensed with a dawning, chilling certainty. This was no longer a humiliation. This was the prelude to a reckoning. The scraps of the torn invitation still drifted on the currents of air, eddying across the marble floor when a new sound cut through the silence. Enough. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, but it carried. It was clear, steady, and impossible to ignore. The crowd turned as one. Kaylin Vance, the young reporter, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his press badge glinting under the chandeliers. He was young, not yet seasoned by the cynicism of his profession, and his face was flushed with a conviction that bordered on reckless. He had been holding his camera low, recording everything, but now his voice was louder than his lens. "She had an invitation," he said firmly, his voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "We all saw it. You tore it up. But that doesn't erase the fact that she was invited." Murmurs rippled through the hall. A few guests shifted on their feet, embarrassed, caught in the uncomfortable space between their complicity and their conscience. Isabella Thorne froze mid-sneer, her smile stiffening into a grotesque mask. "Excuse me?" she hissed, the useless microphone still clutched in her hand. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" The reporter didn't retreat. He took another step forward, his camera now rising to chest level, recording openly, defiantly. "I'm someone who believes evidence matters," he said, his voice gaining strength, "and I have it all on tape." The crowd stirred, a palpable shift in the energy of the room. Phones tilted higher, no longer trying to be discreet. Suddenly, the balance of power wavered. This was no longer a private theater for the elite. It was becoming a public record. It was testimony. Another voice chimed in, more hesitant but brave. It belonged to Eleonora Vance, a grande dame of Neo-Viridia's old guard, a woman whose pearls glinted faintly at her throat and whose opinion still carried immense weight. "He's right," she said, her voice a low, commanding contralto. "I saw the seal myself. That envelope was genuine." Gasps swept the hall, a ripple of collective discomfort that spread through the guests who had been laughing just moments before. Isabella's face tightened, a flash of pure panic sparking behind her eyes before she quickly masked it with a fresh layer of scorn. "Please," she sneered, trying to regain control, "do not lecture me about what belongs in my husband's tower." But the silence that followed her words wasn't agreement. It was fracture. Some guests suddenly found the tips of their expensive shoes fascinating. Others glanced nervously at the woman in blue, their expressions shifting rapidly. Mockery replaced by curiosity, amusement replaced by a growing unease. The live stream chat surged with adrenaline. Yes, finally, someone spoke up. That reporter is a hero. Red dress lady looks nervous now. The woman in cobalt blue hadn't moved a muscle, but her stillness had acted as a catalyst. Her composure had summoned the first voice of dissent, had given others the permission to find their own courage. And now, Isabella's stage was cracking beneath her heels. The reporter held her gaze, unwavering. "You tried to erase her presence by destroying a piece of paper," he said, his voice clear and damning. "But you can't erase the truth, and now the entire world is watching." The words landed with more force than any insult she had thrown all evening. For the first time that night, Isabella Thorne faltered. Her laughter was gone, her grip on the microphone tightening as though it were a lifeline that might slip through her fingers. The woman in blue remained silent, but her silence no longer stood alone. It was joined now by witnesses, by cameras, by a rising tide of doubt that was about to become a tidal wave. And in that hall of marble and glass, the balance of power shifted, decisively and forever. One voice had broken the spell. Then two. The hall was restless now, the air thick with tension and regret. The spell of cruel laughter had been shattered. The stage no longer belonged to the wife in red. Eyes that had once followed her every gesture now turned, slowly, inevitably, toward the woman in cobalt blue. And at last she moved. It was not a hurried movement, not a defensive one. It was simply deliberate. She bent down, her movements fluid and graceful, her fingers brushing against the cold marble where the fragments of her invitation lay scattered like fallen snow. She picked up one piece, the half bearing the broken golden seal, folded it once, gently, and placed it on the edge of the nearest cocktail table. It was not an act of surrender, but of preservation. She was logging it as evidence, not evidence of her loss, but of Isabella's disrespect. Then she straightened to her full height. Her gaze swept once across the room, calm, steady, taking in every face, every camera. And then her silence broke, not with volume, but with the profound weight of truth. "You tore paper," she said softly. Her voice was not loud, but it was resonant, filling the stunned quiet of the hall. "But you cannot tear ownership." The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with meaning. Isabella Thorne blinked, startled, as if a statue had just spoken to her. "Excuse me?" The woman in cobalt blue took a single deliberate step forward. Her heels clicked against the marble, a sound sharper and more authoritative than the microphone static had ever been. "This tower," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet, steely edge, "this monument you celebrate tonight is built on funding, on signatures, on partnerships." Murmurs swelled through the crowd. Guests leaned closer, their minds racing, trying to connect the dots. Her eyes remained fixed on Isabella, unwavering, unblinking. "And some of us," she said, pausing for effect, "did not need to borrow invitations to enter this hall. Some of us signed the checks that made its existence possible." Gasps erupted like a string of firecrackers. Kaylin Vance's live stream chat went completely insane. "Wait, what? She's a backer? She's the money? Orange Lady is the money." The chat hadn't updated to blue. Isabella's face drained of all color. Her perfectly painted mouth opened, then closed, then twisted into a mask of pure disbelief. "You, what are you implying?" The woman in blue did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth was her amplifier. "I am not here to watch your tower rise," she said, each word a perfectly placed stone building a new reality. "I am one of the primary reasons it stands at all." A low roar rolled through the crowd, heavier this time, a sound of dawning, horrified comprehension. Some clutched their glasses tighter. Others whispered names of private equity firms, of secretive hedge funds, of powerful, unseen international backers. The young reporter's lens caught every flicker of shock on Isabella's face, every jaw tightening in the crowd as a terrible recognition began to set in. The woman in blue let the silence reclaim the hall for one final, pregnant moment. Then, with the devastating precision of a master strategist, she delivered the final blow. "You wanted me removed," she said, her voice now cold and clear as a diamond. "But without me, there is no grand opening ceremony. Without me, there is no tower." The room froze. Isabella staggered half a step back, her hand still clutching the microphone, as if it might anchor her to the reality that was rapidly dissolving around her. But no sound came. Her laughter was gone. Her stage was shattered. Her power was an illusion. The woman in cobalt blue lowered her gaze briefly, then looked out at the assembled guests. She looked at them not as a stranger, not as an intruder, but as a sovereign, calmly surveying what she already owned. And for the first time that night, the hall truly recognized her. Not her dress, not her silence. Her, and that recognition carried more power than any microphone, any insult, any empire built on arrogance and borrowed prestige. For a moment the words hung suspended in the air, a declaration so immense, so reality-altering, that the room seemed unable to process it. "Without me, there is no tower." Then the silence cracked, and the room fractured. Gasps rippled through the hall like seismic aftershocks. Guests who had been laughing smugly just minutes earlier now pressed closer, whispering furiously, their faces pale with shock. Names were finally being spoken. The right names. Serafina Vance. Vance Capital. The multi-billion-dollar private equity fund from the London sector. The unseen, notoriously private backer who had swooped in to finance the final, most critical phase of the Apex project when Julian Thorne's own capital had run thin. Rumors had flown for months about a silent partner, a powerful, anonymous figure who had made the tower possible. And now, one of them, the primary one, was standing right here in a simple cobalt blue dress. Phones tilted higher, cameras zoomed closer, desperate to capture the face of the woman who had just upended their entire world. Kalen Vance's live stream surged past 1 million viewers. His chat scrolled so fast it was an unreadable blur of pure, unadulterated shock. "It's Serafina Vance. She funded the tower. This is bigger than we thought." Blue Queen just flipped the entire script. Isabella Thorne is so fucked. Isabella herself looked shaken to her very core. Her crimson smile had not just faltered. It had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. The microphone trembled violently in her hand. She tried to laugh, to dismiss it all as a lie, but the sound that came out was a thin, scraping noise, like metal on bone. What nonsense is this?" she stammered, her eyes darting wildly toward the guards, toward the crowd, toward her husband who was nowhere to be seen, anywhere but at the calm, resolute face of Serafina Vance. But the crowd was no longer with her. Eleanora Vance, the woman in pearls, spoke again, her voice ringing with the authority of her station. "I told you that invitation was real. She belongs here more than any of us." Another voice joined from the back of the room. A man in a navy suit with silver at his temples, a rival developer named Marcus Sterling. "More than belongs," he said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "If she is who I now believe she is, and I have no doubt that she is, then half of us owe tonight's champagne to her name on a contract." The murmurs swelled into a current, a powerful tide turning against the woman in red. Faces shifted from amusement to shame, from complicity to awe. The laughter that had once carried Isabella on its shoulders was gone, replaced by a rising wave of recognition and respect that she could not control, could not command, could not comprehend. And through it all, Seraphina Vance stood calm, her presence as unshakable as the foundation of the tower itself. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply allowed the truth to do its work, to dismantle the false reality Isabella had constructed. The live stream chat exploded again. This is history. Absolute respect. She kept her quiet until the absolute perfect moment. Power doesn't need to shout. Power waits. The two guards, who had hovered uncertainly for so long, now took a deliberate step back, their eyes lowered in a gesture of deference. They had no orders they could possibly justify anymore. To touch her now would be to lay hands on the tower itself. Isabella's composure cracked further, shattering into 1,000 pieces. You think this changes anything?" she sputtered, her voice straining, desperate. "This is my husband's project, his empire, not yours." But even as she spoke the words, she heard the whispers she could no longer silence. Funding, ownership, equity stakes, signatures. The empire she had so proudly invoked no longer felt like hers to claim. It felt like it belonged, in its entirety, to the woman she had tried so cruelly to erase. Isabella's laughter died in her throat. The cameras stayed fixed on her trembling hand, on the microphone shaking so violently it seemed even the steel frame could sense the cataclysmic shift in power. And in the center of the grand marble hall, the woman in cobalt blue remained unshaken, the still, quiet point around which the entire glittering world had just turned. The hall was no longer hers. Not the wife in red, not the jeering crowd, not even the Mogul whose name glittered on the worthless scraps of the invitations. It belonged, now and forever, to the woman in cobalt blue. She let the silence hold for one moment longer, letting the new reality settle in. Every camera was fixed on her, every whisper caught in its own echo. Then, with a calmness that felt almost supernatural, she reached into her simple clutch. A single, sleek leather folder emerged, understated, elegant, the kind of object most of the guests, in their obsession with flash and glitter, would have completely overlooked. But as she opened it, sliding a single document free, the air in the room tightened again, becoming thin, electric. She held the single sheet of paper gently, as though it weighed nothing. And yet everyone in the room could feel its immense, crushing gravity. "This," she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "is the transfer authorization." A few audible gasps detonated in the quiet. Glasses clinked against marble as hands began to tremble. Isabella staggered a full step back, a hand flying to her throat. You can't." But Seraphina Vance continued, her voice as steady and unshaken as her gaze. "As of tonight, my controlling stake of $8.3 billion will no longer support this tower or any future Thorn enterprise." The words landed like a precision strike. 8.3 billion. The number itself was an explosion. Kaylin Vance's live stream chat simply erupted into a cascade of exploding head emojis. 8.3 billion. She doesn't own the tower. She is the tower. Red dress lady just lost everything. Ever. Seraphina lowered the paper slowly, deliberately, as if closing a chapter. "Without that funding, this skyscraper is not an empire. It is a shell of steel and glass, an empty monument to your husband's debt. And without me, your celebration ends here." The crowd broke into utter chaos. Some were gasping, some were actually applauding, some were simply frozen in disbelief. A prominent banker near the stage pressed a hand to his forehead, whispering to himself, She's pulling the lifeline. It's over. Another guest muttered, 8 billion, just gone. And still, Serafina stood steady, her gaze lifted, sweeping across the sea of shocked faces, landing last on the ashen, broken face of Isabella Thorne. "You thought you could erase me with laughter," she said, her tone sharpening, precise as a surgeon's blade. "You thought you could erase me with ripped paper and cheap insults born of your own insecurity. But you have a fundamental misunderstanding of power. I do not ask to belong. I decide what belongs." Isabella's face was a ruin, her hand trembling around the now useless microphone. For the first time all night, she had absolutely nothing to say. Serafina Vance closed the leather folder, the soft click of the magnetic clasp echoing with an undeniable finality. She tucked it back into her clutch. As of this moment, the controlling interest in this tower returns to me. My investment, my name, my decision. The crowd gasped one last time, a great unified wave of awe this time, not cruelty. The live stream chat flooded with fire emojis, with crowns, with raised fists. And in the profound silence that followed, it was no longer the Mogul's wife who stood at the center of attention. It was the woman she had mocked, belittled, and dismissed. The quiet, self-made CEO. Her presence filled the hall, undeniable, unshakable, absolute. The skyscraper looming above them no longer gleamed as a monument to Julian Thorne's triumph. It gleamed as her reclamation. The reckoning was complete. The hall had collapsed into a storm of frantic whispers. Billion-dollar deals were unraveling mid-sentence. Fortunes were being lost in the time it took to refresh a stock feed. Glasses of champagne sat untouched and forgotten. Guests scrolled through their phones in utter disbelief as headlines, fueled by Kaylin Vance's viral stream, spread faster than the champagne had ever been poured. Serafina Vance seizes control of Apex Tower. Thorne Empire crumbles at Gala. The blue dress reckoning. But at the very center of it all, she was still. The woman in cobalt blue did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She simply closed her clutch, placed one hand lightly on her hip, and turned toward the grand staircase that led to the exit. Every eye in the room followed her. The guards, who had once been ordered to physically remove her, now stepped aside, their heads bowed in a gesture of quiet, profound acknowledgement. The photographer from the business magazine lowered his camera, understanding that the greatest picture had already been taken, that the story had already told itself. Even the string quartet, who had not played a single note since the first insult was hurled, watched her as if they were waiting for a cue, a sign from their new conductor. Isabella Thorne stood frozen, the microphone slack in her hand, her crimson dress suddenly looking less like fire and more like dying embers, like ashes. The venomous smile that had begun the evening was gone, replaced by a vacant, shattered expression. What remained was silence. The very same silence she had mocked and weaponized, now turned against her, suffocating her. Serafina Vance walked slowly, each step measured, unhurried. Her heels touched the marble like punctuation marks at the end of a long, epic story. Final and absolute. And with every step, the message crystallized into an unforgettable lesson for everyone who watched, both in that room and across the world. Power does not shout. It does not need validation or laughter or microphones to prove its existence. Real power waits. It observes. It endures. And when the moment is right, it speaks once, and the world rearranges itself around that truth. The live stream chat was still exploding, a digital testament to the evening. Blue Queen. This is what dignity looks like. Justice served without a single scream. I will never forget this night. At the grand doorway, she paused. The light from the nebula chandeliers caught the cobalt blue fabric one last time, and for a fleeting moment, It looked like a steady, living flame. Alive, unextinguishable. She turned her head slightly, just enough for the crowd to see her profile. There was not a smile, not a glare, only a calm, quiet recognition of the new reality she had just created. Then, she stepped through the doors and into the cool night air, leaving the hall and its inhabitants in a state of stunned, reverberating silence. Behind her, the apex tower loomed, its glass and steel edges cutting into the night sky. But it no longer belonged to the Thorn Empire. It belonged to her. The woman they had tried to erase, the one who had chosen dignity over spectacle, composure over chaos, and substance over noise. Justice had not shouted. It had not screamed. It had simply walked out the door in a cobalt blue dress. And what did this all mean? What's the value here? The lesson we take away into the dawn of a new day? It's that legacy isn't built with glass and steel alone. It's not cemented by arrogance or inherited names. True legacy is forged in the quiet moments of integrity, in the refusal to be diminished, in the profound understanding that your worth is not determined by the room you walk into, but by the strength you bring into that room. Serafina Vance didn't just reclaim a building, she redefined power for everyone who was watching. The Apex Tower was no longer a monument to one man's ego. It was now, and would forever be, a beacon of quiet strength, a testament to the woman who knew that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. What did you take away from Serafina's story tonight? Let's talk about it right now, in the comments. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for being a part of this incredible community. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice being served. Until next time, stand tall and hold your ground.